everybody, and welcome back to the channel. My name's Amanda N, and today we're going to talk a little bit about vampires. First of all, I want to thank you all for your patience. I know I've been a little bit more spotty than I'd like to be. Doggo was still a little bit sick. Things are a little bit better now. If you hear any noise in the background, it's just my hamster throwing a temper tantrum because they finally got attention today and they hate having their cage cleaned. Anyway, so thank you so much for all your patience. Anyway, we're going to talk about vampires. We've talked about quite a bit of creepy folklore on this channel, and maybe when you hear vampires, you think of Dracula or Twilight. But today I wanted to look really briefly at just the origins of vampires. I won't talk too much about, Vlad the Impaler or Dracula himself or Bathory or other cases. Maybe we can save that for another video, but today let's go back to the very beginning. Now, vampirism, not unlike a lot of folklore, got its start from plagues and diseases and things like that that people just really didn't understand back in the Middle Ages. So back then, bleeding mouth lesions were actually kind of common, which, yeah, pretty gross, but that's one of the first so-called sure signs that someone's a vampire, because perhaps rather than saying that's a lesion that's bleeding in someone's mouth, it's easier to think that they drank blood. I don't know, but blood disorders can also cause blisters on the skin that are exposed to sunlight, and porphyria, which hopefully I'm saying that right, can cause this, and some certain strains of porphyria can actually be temporarily relieved by ingesting blood. So, by the sounds of it, this blood disorder, porphyria, seems to share a lot of similarities with what we would consider vampirism. So, this drinking of blood is kind of the main myth that's really central to this, even if there are other things that have been added throughout the years, like, sparkly Edward Cullen. In addition to porphyria, rabies and tuberculosis are thought to be other diseases that are pretty widely associated with vampirism. Rabies because you might be really opposed to the light or to strong smells, so light and garlic, and then tuberculosis can have waste, being wasting away, kind of like a vampire might. Britannica describes it by saying that vampire myths were really popular in Eastern Europe, and the word vampire is probably from that region in and of itself. So digging up the bodies of suspected vampires was practiced in a lot of cultures, and the natural characteristics of decomposition, like receding gums and the appearance of growing hair and fingernails, kind of reinforced the idea that, oh, these corpses were still alive, when in actuality, those are just normal parts of the decomposition process. Because of all the constraints of medical diagnosis at the time, people who were really ill or sometimes even just drunk would be thought dead and then miraculously recover. And in that case, it's too late to prevent their burial. So the belief in vampires led to people staking corpses through the heart before they were buried, which, if you were actually still alive, I mean, what a way to go. In some cultures, the dead were even buried face down to prevent them from finding their way out of graves, to know where they were when they woke up, which, again, if you were actually alive and woke up like that, what a way to go. That's horrifying. I also wanted to briefly discuss the cages on graves. There's a pretty common misconception that I've just kind of seen floating around the internet that's like, oh, people put cages on graves to keep the dead from getting out. It doesn't really seem like that's the case. Instead, the cages on the graves were actually meant to prevent the living from getting in, which sounds pretty creepy when I put it that way, but instead, the idea of, grave robbing was very common and a way to earn money, especially for aspiring doctors and surgeons and things like that. Where do they get their bodies? Well, sometimes the newly dead ones. So the idea of grave robbing is usually associated with the cages that are on graves, as opposed to, oh, people can't get out. It seems like putting a stake through the heart would have been a more common way to keep someone from getting out. I'm not saying that the cages were never used this way, but it just doesn't seem like they're common use. Now, vampire stories in and of themselves didn't really start to emerge until kind of the early 1800s-ish, or at least that's when they started to become more common, and this is when Vlad Dracula of Transylvania, Vlad III the Impaler, is thought to, of course, inspire Dracula himself. Naturally, so while some say he liked to drink the blood of his victims and dip his bread in their blood, it's a bit difficult to kind of discern the myth from the reality here. And for a while after this time period, especially into the early 1900s, like films, Nosferatu, vampires were seen as evil and undead creatures. They were still pretty much, the realms of Frankenstein, this evil, horrible, you don't go near them, undead kind of ghoulish being. But in the mid-1950s, Ray Bradbury kind of gave them a sympathetic monster kind of feel, is how I guess I'll put it. If you've ever been to the subreddit Sympathetic Monsters, it's one of my favorite. It kind of humanizes monsters, and I think it's really cute. So that's kind of like what Ray Bradbury did, I guess I'll say. And the idea of vampires being normal guys that turned evil or hidden among us started to emerge, and then with my interview with a vampire and other vampire stories that came out in the following decades, actually started depicting them as even desirable, or, oh, they're hiding out from us and interacting with their covens and their white skin and superhuman speed and strength, and they kind of started to gain more powers as they went along and became more beautiful and more desirable as it went. And now, of course, here we are today where they're sparkling. Also, sorry, I'm pretty sure that is my hamster. Yeah, he's trying to drag a tiny little log through his tubes. Sorry about that if you're hearing any noise in the background. But anyway, we're pretty much set there for today. The origins of vampires do largely seem to be involved in plagues and diseases, like so many other folklore, so many other origin stories of monsters like this. And the idea of them becoming what they are today is simply a matter of humanizing them, humanizing monsters, which I find pretty cool. Let me know if there's any specific vampires you'd like to see me discuss. I've tried to do that before on the channel. Sometimes there isn't enough information about them, sometimes there is. I've also seen murderers just kind of almost be dismissed as just monsters and vampires, which I think is really fascinating too, how even serial killers way back then, they were called vampires. They were thought to just be monsters, maybe because we couldn't imagine someone human doing something so terrible. But let me know if you'd like to see that. Sorry again for the noise, and I will see you next time. Bye, guys!